Roslyn Duvall was 75 years old when the man she had stood beside for 52 years carried the last box of her life onto the front porch, locked the front door, and never looked back. She had helped build his business. She had sacrificed her dreams. And in the end, she walked away with little more than a suitcase. Most people would have moved in with family. Most would have given up. Roslyn did something no one expected. She spent her last $10 on an abandoned gas station along a forgotten stretch of highway in western Missouri. People laughed. They said the roof would collapse before winter. They said the place had been dead for decades. But no one laughed when she unlocked the weathered door marked Room 7. The office inside looked as though its owner had stepped out only minutes earlier. A calendar still hung open. Coffee still sat beside the desk. Unopened mail waited exactly where it had been left, and tucked among the dust-covered records was something no one had touched for more than 40 years. Something that would reunite strangers with voices they thought were lost forever, and reveal why this forgotten station had been quietly protecting one man's final promise all along. If stories of courage, second chances, and hidden truths mean something to you, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what Roslyn discovers after opening that door. Then, Roslyn reached for the first file. Roslyn Duvall stood in the front hallway, listening to footsteps that no longer belonged to her life. The movers weren't careless. They weren't rude. They simply did the job they had been hired to do. One by one, cardboard boxes disappeared through the front door, carrying away 52 years of memories that no inventory sheet could ever record. On the living room wall, a lighter rectangle marked the place where their wedding photograph had hung for decades. The picture was gone. Only the outline remained. Sometimes, the empty space left behind hurts more than the thing that filled it. Outside, the early autumn air settled over the quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri. Maple leaves drifted across the front yard as if nothing unusual was happening. Across the street, a woman walking her dog slowed for a moment, then quietly kept going. No one knew what to say. At 75 years old, Roslyn had become something she never imagined. A stranger standing inside her own home. Vernon never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His silence did all the work. He stood near the dining room window, with his hands in his pockets, watching the moving truck instead of the woman who had shared more than half a century of her life with him. "We've already signed everything," he said, without turning around. "Dragging this out won't change anything." His words landed with the weight of a closing door. Roslyn didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. The lawyers had finished weeks earlier. The judge had signed the final papers. The bank accounts had been divided. The retirement funds calculated. The house, legally, belonged to Vernon. She had signed the settlement because she couldn't bear the thought of spending the remaining years of her life fighting in courtrooms. Peace had seemed worth more than possessions. Standing there now, she wondered if peace always arrived carrying grief with it. She walked slowly through the kitchen. Every cabinet reminded her of another season of life. She could still picture herself answering customer calls while stirring soup on the stove. Back then, the freight brokerage wasn't much more than a folding table, one telephone, and two determined people refusing to fail. Truck drivers called at every hour. Invoices had been typed after midnight. Payroll was balanced with a calculator that clicked so loudly it sometimes woke the children. When cash ran short, Roslyn quietly postponed buying herself new clothes. When business finally improved, she celebrated by paying employees first. No magazine ever printed her photograph. No award ever carried her name. People praised Vernon for building the company. Roslyn never corrected them. She didn't need recognition. She believed marriage meant building one life together, not keeping score. Perhaps that had been her greatest mistake. She opened the pantry one last time. An old coffee mug sat on the highest shelf. The faded lettering read, "World's Best Bookkeeper." Their youngest daughter had given it to her nearly 30 years earlier. Roslyn smiled. Then she carefully wrapped it inside a towel before placing it into the final box. The movers carried it outside. That box contained almost everything she truly wanted to keep. Not valuables, memories. When she stepped onto the porch, Vernon finally looked at her. For just a moment. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. If anything, it was impatient. "I hope you'll be happier now," he said. Roslyn studied the man she had loved since she was 23 years old. The lines on his face had deepened. His hair had turned silver, but somewhere along the journey toward success, he had become a man she no longer recognized. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she answered softly. She meant it, because whatever Vernon believed he was chasing, it could never be found by leaving another human being behind. She climbed into her aging sedan. The engine hesitated before starting. It sounded tired. She understood exactly how it felt. As she drove away, she refused to look back in the rearview mirror, not because she hated the house, because she loved it too much. Roslyn spent the next several days searching for somewhere she could afford. A small apartment near downtown, too expensive. A retirement community, far beyond her budget. A modest mobile home outside the city, already sold. Each conversation ended politely. Each price felt impossible. Her divorce settlement looked reasonable on paper, until real life began subtracting from it. She could have called her son in Kansas City. She could have accepted her daughter's invitation to move into the spare bedroom in Columbia. But every time her hand reached for the phone, she stopped. Her children had families, jobs, responsibilities. She had spent her entire adult life solving problems. She wasn't ready to become someone else's. On Thursday evening, with daylight fading beyond the library windows, Roslyn opened the county's online foreclosure listings. Most properties were exactly what she expected: vacant lots, condemned houses, tax-defaulted commercial buildings. She almost closed the page when one listing caught her eye. Former highway service station, opening bid, $10. She blinked, then leaned closer to the screen. $10? That couldn't be right. She clicked the listing. Several photographs appeared: rusted fuel pumps, a sagging canopy, broken windows, weeds swallowing cracked pavement. It looked forgotten, not dangerous. Then her eyes stopped on a single sentence buried deep inside the county description. Property includes former service station, maintenance garage, and 7 attached lodging units. Roslyn frowned. 7 lodging units? She clicked through every photograph again. One image showed a narrow row of weathered doors behind the station. She counted them slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then 7. The 7th door looked different, older, heavier, and unlike the others, it still carried what appeared to be an official metal seal. Roslyn leaned back in her chair. For reasons she couldn't explain, she couldn't stop looking at that door. Something about it refused to let go. She printed the listing, folded the paper carefully, and slipped it into her purse. Tomorrow morning, she would drive out to see the station for herself. She had no idea that the decision she made in the next 24 hours would change not only the rest of her life, but reopen a story that had been waiting more than 40 years for someone to finally unlock it. Roslyn left home before sunrise the next morning, the folded property listing resting on the passenger seat beside her. The highway gradually narrowed as Springfield disappeared behind her. Traffic became lighter. The roadside grew quieter. Mile after mile, she wondered whether she was chasing hope, or simply refusing to surrender to disappointment. Nearly 2 hours later, the abandoned station came into view. It stood exactly where the county photographs had shown it, beside a forgotten stretch of highway that no longer carried much traffic. The rusted fuel pumps still stood beneath a weathered canopy. Tall grass swallowed most of the cracked parking lot. Wind drifted through broken weeds, carrying a silence that felt strangely peaceful instead of lonely. Roslyn stepped out of her car. She expected to feel discouraged. Instead, she felt curious. The place wasn't beautiful, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a story that had never been finished. She walked slowly around the property, taking in details the photographs hadn't captured. Behind the station stood 7 small roadside rooms built decades earlier for travelers passing through, before the interstate redirected nearly everyone onto faster roads. Each door showed years of neglect. Each looked much the same, at least until her eyes reached the last one. She made a quiet note of it before continuing her walk. The sound of another vehicle pulling onto the shoulder interrupted her thoughts. An elderly man climbed from an old pickup truck and smiled politely. "Haven't seen anyone looking this closely in a long time," he said. Roslyn returned the smile. "I'm thinking about buying it." He looked across the station with familiar eyes. "My daddy used to bring us here every Saturday morning. Best coffee around." His expression softened. Emmett Calder ran this place. Honest man. Not long afterward, another resident stopped by. Then another. Word seemed to spread quickly that someone was finally interested in the old station. Each visitor carried a different memory. One remembered stopping for gasoline before early fishing trips. Another recalled bringing stranded travelers inside during snowstorms. Someone else laughed while remembering how Emmett trusted people to pay later if they came up short. No one talked about how much money he made. No one mentioned awards. Instead, they remembered something far more valuable, that he treated people well. Sometimes, the wealthiest life isn't measured by what someone leaves behind, but by the kindness strangers still remember years after they're gone. Roslyn listened more than she spoke. She wasn't simply learning about an old building. She was beginning to understand the man who had filled it with life. Then, almost without warning, the conversation changed. One resident glanced toward the row of roadside rooms. "You'll probably want to fix those up too." "I hope so," Roslyn replied. The man nodded toward the final door. That wasn't really one of the guest rooms. Roslyn waited for him to continue. He didn't. A woman standing nearby quietly added, "Best leave that one alone." There was no fear in her voice, only certainty. Before Roslyn could ask why, another person changed the subject entirely. Within moments, everyone was talking about the old highway again, as though Room 7 had never been mentioned. The silence felt intentional. Not one person seemed willing to explain further. That afternoon, Roslyn met with county officials and completed the paperwork. $10 later, the forgotten station belonged to her. Most people saw a property no one wanted. Roslyn saw something different. She saw a place that had once mattered, and she believed places like that deserved another chance, just as people did. The following morning, she returned carrying work gloves, trash bags, and a sturdy broom. She began clearing weeds near the front of the station when an elderly mechanic wandered over from the garage across the road. He introduced himself as Walter. After watching her work for a few moments, he spoke quietly. "You know, I've seen several people think about buying this place." Roslyn leaned on the broom. What changed their minds? Walter looked toward the row of roadside rooms. They all started asking questions about Room 7. And they never finished the purchase. He offered nothing more. No explanation, no rumors, just that single fact. Roslyn turned toward the last door again. For the first time, she walked all the way to it. The weathered wood had faded with age. The old brass handle had turned dull. Then she noticed something she had somehow missed before. Fastened across the door, still untouched after more than 40 years, was an official county probate seal. The old probate seal stayed on Roslyn's mind long after she locked the station for the evening. She could have pried it off. No one was watching. The county had already transferred ownership of the property into her name. But something about that faded strip of metal demanded respect. 40 years had passed, and it was still doing the job someone had trusted it to do. Roslyn had spent most of her life believing that shortcuts usually became tomorrow's regrets. If there was a right way to open Room 7, she intended to find it. The following morning, she drove to the county courthouse. Unlike the abandoned station, the courthouse was full of movement. Clerks carried stacks of files through narrow hallways. Attorneys hurried between offices. Visitors waited patiently beneath old fluorescent lights that had probably witnessed thousands of ordinary days, much like this one. Roslyn stepped to the public records counter and unfolded the property documents. "I recently purchased the old Calder Highway service station," she explained. "One of the rooms still has a probate seal attached to the door. I'd like to understand why." The clerk looked surprised. "The Calder station?" She nodded. "I don't believe anyone has asked about that in years." After several minutes of searching through computerized records, the woman frowned. "Most of those files aren't digitized." She disappeared into the archives. When she returned, she carried several aging storage boxes whose labels had faded almost beyond recognition. Dust rose gently as the lids were opened. Inside rested court files that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Roslyn spent the better part of the afternoon reading page after page of probate records. Little by little, the story became clearer. Emmett Calder had died unexpectedly from a heart attack in October 1983. Because he owned both the service station and several business assets, the probate court ordered his office secured until the estate could be fully reviewed. At first, the process appeared routine. Then complications began. One heir had moved without leaving a forwarding address. Another legal notice was returned unopened. Business records still required verification. As months turned into years, the case slowed. Eventually, it slipped into administrative storage. Employees retired. Departments reorganized. Boxes were relocated. What had begun as a temporary court order quietly became 4 decades of silence. Sometimes history isn't lost because someone hides it. Sometimes it's simply forgotten beneath the weight of newer responsibilities. Roslyn closed the final folder and sat quietly for a moment. Room 7 hadn't been abandoned on purpose. It had been left waiting. As she prepared to leave, an older gentleman carrying a worn leather briefcase paused beside the records counter. One of the clerks smiled. Mr. Harper used to work probate before he retired. The name seemed to catch Roslyn's attention. "Excuse me," she said. "Would you happen to remember Emmett Calder?" The retired clerk stopped walking. A slow smile crossed his face. "I remember him very well." He accepted the folder she handed him and adjusted his glasses. Reliable fellow, organized beyond belief. He chuckled softly. "I don't think I ever saw a businessman label files the way Emmett did." Roslyn listened carefully. "He had a saying," Mr. Harper continued, "every time someone questioned why he wrote everything down." The older man paused before repeating the words exactly as he remembered them. "If the truth matters, write it down." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Some people leave behind buildings. Others leave behind principles that continue guiding strangers long after they're gone. Roslyn suddenly understood why so many people still spoke of Emmett with quiet respect. Not because he owned a gas station, because he had earned their trust. Mr. Harper looked thoughtfully toward the archive room. "I always wondered what became of that office." "It was never reopened?" Roslyn asked. He shook his head. After the estate stalled, everyone assumed someone else would eventually handle it. His expression softened. "I'm glad someone finally cared enough to ask." The legal process wasn't finished that day. Over the following weeks, Roslyn completed every requirement the county requested. She signed affidavits, acknowledging responsibility for the abandoned business records. Notices were mailed to the remaining heirs of record. Waiting periods passed. Additional documents were reviewed before the final authorization could be issued. The process tested her patience, but she never complained. Some doors become meaningful because they cannot be opened quickly. One crisp autumn morning, the courthouse called. Everything had been approved. Mr. Harper happened to be visiting that day when the authorization papers were placed into Roslyn's hands. Along with them came a small envelope. Inside rested an old brass key tagged in fading handwriting. Room 7. Roslyn wrapped her fingers around it carefully. The metal felt unexpectedly heavy. As she turned to leave, Mr. Harper spoke one final time. "You might discover why people respected Emmett so much." His voice trailed away before quietly finishing the thought. "Or why some preferred the room stay closed." The drive back to the station felt different. The paperwork rested safely on the passenger seat. The original key lay beside it. For more than 40 years, both had been waiting for someone willing to finish what time had left unfinished. And by the time the sun dipped behind the old highway, Roslyn was standing once again before the weathered door of Room 7. Roslyn stood before the weathered door as late afternoon sunlight stretched across the empty station. The brass key rested quietly in her hand. For more than 40 years, this door had remained closed, not because someone had forgotten it, because the law had asked everyone to leave it alone. She slipped the key into the old lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a firm turn, the mechanism gave way. A deep metallic click echoed through the silent hallway. Roslyn wrapped both hands around the handle and pulled gently. The heavy wooden door resisted at first, as though time itself had settled against the other side. Then it slowly opened. A cool breath of stale air drifted into the hallway. Roslyn didn't step inside immediately. She simply stood there, looking, listening, waiting. The room before her didn't resemble an abandoned office. It resembled a day that had never ended. Dust covered every surface, softening the edges of desks, shelves, and cabinets, yet nothing appeared disturbed. A wall calendar still displayed October 1983. Beside an aging adding machine rested a coffee cup with a dark ring still visible inside. Truck route maps remained pinned neatly across one wall. Payroll ledgers filled wooden shelves in careful order. A rack of labeled keys hung beside the doorway, exactly where someone had last placed them. On the desk, unopened mail waited patiently beneath a thin blanket of dust. It looked as though Emmett Calder had stepped outside to help a customer, fully expecting to return before the afternoon was over. Instead, the room had spent more than 4 decades waiting for someone else. Roslyn felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat. She had walked into abandoned buildings before. They usually spoke of neglect. This room spoke of interruption. There is a difference between a place people leave behind and a place life never allowed someone to finish. She took one slow step inside, then another, careful not to disturb anything. Years of keeping financial records for the freight company had taught her something important. The condition of a room can tell its own story, if someone is patient enough to notice it before changing anything. Rather than reaching for the nearest object, Roslyn removed her small camera from her bag. She began documenting everything: the desk, the shelves, the maps, the calendar, the position of every chair, the unopened letters, even the layer of dust itself. She photographed each corner from several angles before writing careful notes in a small notebook she carried with her. If questions ever arose later, she wanted the room remembered exactly as she had first found it. Only after completing the photographs did she begin examining the office more closely. Most of the shelves held ordinary business records, maintenance logs, fuel delivery invoices, payroll books, repair receipts. Everything had been filed with remarkable precision. Emmett hadn't simply operated a gas station, he had documented almost every day of its existence. Roslyn smiled quietly. Mr. Harper had been right. If the truth matters, write it down. Those words seemed to live inside every cabinet. She carefully unlocked the first metal filing cabinet. Inside were neatly labeled folders containing maintenance reports dating back years before Emmett's death. The second cabinet held photographs. Some showed smiling families standing beside station wagons. Others captured truck drivers gathered outside the garage, coffee cups warming their hands before sunrise. There were snapshots of holiday decorations, summer picnics, retirement parties, ordinary moments that most people never think to preserve. Roslyn realized something as she studied each photograph. Very few pictures focused on the station itself. Nearly all of them focused on people. Perhaps Emmett had understood something many businesses forget. Buildings serve customers. People build communities. The third cabinet proved different. It contained several leather-bound journals stacked neatly beside a collection of small cardboard storage boxes. Each box carried handwritten labels. Roslyn lifted the lid from the first one. Inside lay cassette tapes, dozens of them. She opened another box, more tapes, then another, and another. She carefully counted every labeled container before consulting the inventory sheet tucked beneath the top folder. 387 cassette tapes. Every single one had been labeled with remarkable care. Driver's name, truck number, date, destination. Nothing appeared random. Everything belonged to a carefully organized system. Roslyn picked up one cassette. The handwriting had faded slightly with age, but it remained perfectly readable. She imagined the person whose name appeared on the label. Where had they been driving that day? Did they ever return? Did anyone still remember the sound of their voice? Questions filled the quiet office. Answers remained hidden inside the tapes. Resting beside the final storage box was a single folded envelope. Unlike the business records surrounding it, this one carried no official label. Only a few handwritten words appeared across the front. For whoever opens this room. Roslyn hesitated before lifting it. Some letters feel private, even when they're meant to be read. She unfolded the yellowed paper with careful hands. The handwriting matched the labels on the cassette boxes. Strong, steady, deliberate. Her eyes settled on the very first sentence. These voices deserve to outlive the road. Roslyn read it again. Slowly, the words carried a weight that reached far beyond business records or forgotten paperwork. Who were these voices? Why had Emmett collected them? And why had he believed preserving them mattered so much? The office no longer felt like a forgotten workspace. It had become the beginning of a mystery. One built not around money or hidden treasure, but around ordinary lives someone had worked remarkably hard to protect. Roslyn looked back toward the rows of carefully labeled cassettes. In one corner of the office, beneath a layer of dust, sat an old tape recorder connected to a pair of small speakers. She walked toward it, carrying the first cassette in both hands. Without realizing it, the next few moments were about to change, not only the future of the abandoned station, but the entire purpose of the life she believed she had been forced to leave behind. Roslyn set the folded letter back onto the desk and looked toward the old tape recorder resting beneath the shelves. For a long moment, she didn't move. The room had already revealed more than she expected. Business records, photographs, journals, 387 carefully labeled cassette tapes. Now she faced a different question. Was she ready to hear the voices Emmett had worked so hard to protect? She carried the tape recorder onto the desk and gently brushed away years of dust with a soft cloth from her supply bag. Dust settled into the afternoon light as she carefully cleaned the buttons, speakers, and cassette compartment. She wasn't restoring an old machine, she was preparing to hear someone's memories. With slow hands, she picked up the first cassette. The label read, David Harper Truck, 214, May 16, 1981, Kansas City Route, Roslyn. Carefully inserted the tape. For a second, nothing happened. Then she pressed play. The reels began turning with a quiet mechanical hum. Static crackled softly through the speaker. A moment later, a calm man's voice filled the silent office. Hi there, Pumpkin. His voice carried the relaxed warmth of someone smiling while he spoke. If your mama's playing this tomorrow, then happy 8th birthday. Roslyn lowered herself into Emmett's old chair without taking her eyes off the recorder. I sure hate missing another birthday. I know I promised I'd be there. The father paused for a moment. You tell your mama I'm sorry. Another gentle laugh followed. But after this next delivery, we're finally going fishing, just you and me. I've already picked out the spot. Roslyn could almost picture the little girl listening. Perhaps sitting cross-legged on a living room floor. Perhaps hugging a teddy bear while hearing her father's voice. I've been thinking about you all day, the man continued. Study hard, be kind to your brother, and don't let anybody tell you that your old dad doesn't love you. The tape ended with 4 quiet words. I love you, Pumpkin. Silence returned to room 7. Roslyn didn't reach for the stop button. She simply sat there. The office no longer felt like a forgotten workplace. It felt like a room where hundreds of ordinary lives had been patiently waiting for someone willing to listen. She looked toward the shelves filled with cassette tapes. Every label represented another family, another story, another voice suspended in time. People often believe history belongs only to famous names. But most of America's story has always been carried by ordinary people who quietly loved their families, worked long days, kept their promises when they could, and worried when they couldn't. Over the next several days, Roslyn listened to only a handful of recordings. She refused to rush through them. Each deserved the same patience with which it had been recorded. One belonged to a Korean War veteran who admitted he found more peace driving lonely highways than talking about the battles he had survived overseas. I never could explain those years, he confessed softly, so I just kept driving. Another recording captured a newly married couple laughing together before the husband climbed back into his truck. They talked about saving every extra dollar toward a small house with a front porch. Neither complained about what they lacked. Instead, they spoke about everything they hoped to build together. Another tape revealed the quiet voice of a widower. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. Perhaps he simply needed another human being to hear what loneliness sounded like. "I still catch myself reaching across the bed some mornings," he admitted. "Funny how habits stay even after people leave." Roslyn quietly closed her eyes. Grief changes with time, but it never completely forgets the people it once loved. The final recording she listened to that week came from a young father with 3 children. Instead of speaking directly to them, he read their favorite bedtime story aloud. Between chapters he laughed, changed his voice for different characters, and occasionally reminded his wife exactly where to pause the tape each night. "So they'll think Daddy's still reading with them." Roslyn smiled through tears. Love has always found remarkable ways to travel home, even across hundreds of lonely highway miles. As she listened, one truth became impossible to ignore. Emmett never interrupted anyone. His own voice appeared nowhere on the recordings. He never offered advice, never asked leading questions, never made himself part of another person's story. He simply provided privacy, a tape recorder, and enough kindness for strangers to speak honestly. That realization drew Roslyn back to the journals stacked inside the filing cabinet. This time, she wasn't looking for business records. She wanted to understand the man behind the recordings. Page after page revealed a father who had never fully recovered from losing his only son in a winter highway accident. One journal entry stopped her completely. Emmett wrote that after his son's death, he realized he would never again hear a new story in his son's voice. That silence became heavier than grief itself. So he made a quiet promise. If he couldn't preserve his own son's final words, perhaps he could help other families keep theirs. Roslyn slowly closed the journal. Sometimes the deepest kindness grows from the deepest heartbreak. People who understand loss often recognize its weight in others, long before anyone else does. Yet something continued troubling her. Scattered throughout the journals, one sentence appeared again and again. "The promise I still haven't fulfilled." Sometimes it appeared by itself, sometimes at the end of an entry, sometimes beside notes about the cassette recordings. But nowhere did Emmett explain what that promise actually was. The mystery hadn't ended. It had grown larger. Late that afternoon, Roslyn found another journal entry that mentioned something she hadn't seen anywhere else. Emmett wrote about a master registry that would one day make it possible to reunite every recording with the proper family. Her heartbeat quickened. She searched every shelf, every drawer, every filing cabinet. Nothing. The registry wasn't there. Roslyn looked once more across the rows of carefully labeled tapes. The recordings had survived. The journals had survived. The office had survived. But the one document capable of telling her where every voice truly belonged had vanished. She carefully locked the office before leaving for the evening. For now, she told no one what she had discovered. Not the county, not the local newspaper, not even the neighbors who stopped by each morning. Before these voices could be shared, she first had to find the families who had been waiting decades to hear them again. Roslyn locked room 7 each evening, with greater care than she locked her own front door. The recordings were no longer simply a remarkable discovery. They had become a responsibility. Every cassette represented someone who had trusted a stranger with words meant for the people they loved most. Those voices deserved more than being stored on a shelf. They deserved to find their way home. Roslyn decided to begin with the very first recording she had heard. David Harper, Truck 214, Kansas City route. She copied every detail from the cassette label into a notebook before driving to the public library. For the next several days, the station became only part of her routine. The investigation became the other. She searched old trucking directories that hadn't been opened in years, newspaper archives filled with faded obituaries, freight industry publications, union newsletters, historical business registrations, county property records, telephone books whose pages had turned yellow with age. Every clue seemed to point somewhere, only to disappear. Many of the trucking companies listed on the cassette labels no longer existed. Some had merged with larger carriers decades earlier. Others had simply closed their doors. Highway numbers had changed. Routes had been redesigned. Businesses that once served entire communities had become empty buildings or vacant lots. Addresses written in Emmett's careful handwriting sometimes led to demolished homes where new developments now stood. The deeper Roslyn searched, the more she realized she wasn't simply looking for people, she was trying to follow lives across 40 years of American change. It would have been easy to quit. No one expected a 75-year-old woman to solve a mystery that history itself had nearly erased. But Roslyn had spent more than 50 years helping build a business one careful record at a time. She understood something many people overlooked. Large answers often begin with small details that everyone else ignores. Week after week, she kept searching. When one lead failed, she tried another. She compared retirement directories with obituary notices. She traced former trucking companies through archive trade publications. She called historical societies. She visited county offices. Sometimes she drove 2 hours simply to confirm that one faded address belonged to the right family decades earlier. Progress came slowly. Then one afternoon, it finally came. A newspaper obituary mentioned a truck driver named David Harper, who had died in a highway accident in 1983. The surviving family members included a daughter. The age matched, the location matched, the dates matched. Roslyn followed one final trail through public records before finding a current mailing address. She stared at the envelope in her hands for several minutes before writing the letter. How do you explain to someone that you may have found the voice of a father they haven't heard in more than 40 years? She chose honesty. Nothing more, nothing less. A week later, the telephone rang inside the station. A quiet woman's voice introduced herself. My name is Emily Harper. There was hesitation in every word. I received your letter. Roslyn invited her to visit whenever she felt ready. 3 days later, a silver sedan pulled slowly into the old parking lot. A woman in her 50s stepped out and looked uncertainly toward the station. Hope and doubt often arrive together. Roslyn greeted her warmly before leading her into room 7. Emily's eyes moved slowly around the preserved office. It feels like time stopped, she whispered. Roslyn nodded. In many ways, I think it did. She placed the cassette into the tape recorder. Neither woman spoke. The familiar hum filled the room. Then, David Harper's voice returned. Hi there, Pumpkin. Emily's hands immediately covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes before another word was spoken. As the birthday message continued, she quietly lowered herself into the same chair where Roslyn had first listened days earlier. She cried without embarrassment, without apology. When the recording reached its final words, I love you, Pumpkin, Emily closed her eyes. For several moments, silence became its own language. Finally, she looked at Roslyn. I was 8 years old. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. My father was killed in a highway accident about 2 years after he recorded that. She wiped away another tear. I remembered what he looked like. A faint smile appeared through the emotion, but I'd forgotten the sound of his voice. Roslyn felt her own eyes begin to sting. There are moments when nothing needs to be explained. Kindness speaks clearly enough on its own. Before leaving, Emily asked if she could listen to the recording one more time. Roslyn simply pressed play. The story spread quietly after that, not through television interviews, not through dramatic headlines, but from one grateful family to another. A handwritten letter arrived asking whether another driver's name appeared among the tapes, then a phone call. Then another letter, some enclosed old photographs, others shared dates, trucking companies, or faded memories that might help identify a loved one. Room 7 slowly became something it had never been before. Not a forgotten office, a place where hope quietly returned. One afternoon, a retired trucking executive named Charles Benton stopped by, after hearing about the recordings from an old colleague. He spent hours studying Emmett's journals with Roslyn. Occasionally, he smiled as familiar names appeared on the pages. Then suddenly, his expression changed. He kept a registry, Charles said. Roslyn looked up immediately. A registry? Charles nodded with certainty. Every driver, every recording, every family contact. He closed the journal thoughtfully. It was the most important thing he had. Roslyn's heartbeat quickened. The journals mention one. Charles looked around the office. It should be here. She quietly shook her head. I've searched every cabinet. Charles remained silent for a long moment before speaking again. The recordings matter. He rested his hand gently on one of the storage boxes. But the registry mattered even more. Roslyn frowned. Why? Because without it, he answered softly, you don't just have voices. You have no way of knowing where all of them belong. For the first time, Roslyn understood the true size of the task before her. Finding the recordings had only been the beginning. Finding the missing registry had become the key to fulfilling Emmett Calder's unfinished promise. Before she could begin searching for it, unexpected visitors started arriving at the station with an entirely different purpose. They weren't looking for history, they were looking to buy the land. The station grew quieter inside and busier outside. Almost every morning, Roslyn unlocked room 7 before the sun climbed above the old highway. Families arrived to hear voices they thought had disappeared forever. Some stayed only an hour. Others remained the entire afternoon, sharing photographs, newspaper clippings, and stories about fathers, mothers, brothers, and husbands who had spent their lives chasing one delivery after another. Then something changed. The visitors were no longer only families. Well-dressed strangers began pulling into the cracked parking lot. They carried measuring tapes instead of old photographs, business cards instead of memories. They weren't interested in the cassette recordings. They were studying the land. One man introduced himself as a commercial property consultant. Another represented a regional development company. A third simply asked whether the station was for sale. Roslyn politely answered the same way every time. It isn't. The first offer arrived by certified mail. The amount surprised her. For a property she had purchased for $10, the figure looked almost unbelievable. She folded the letter and slipped it into a drawer. A week later, another envelope arrived. The second offer was considerably higher. This one included a handwritten note explaining why several companies had suddenly become interested in the property. State transportation officials were considering improvements to the nearby highway corridor. If the project moved forward, land values throughout the area would likely increase. The abandoned station was no longer viewed as forgotten real estate. It had become valuable ground. To the developers, Room 7 wasn't history. It was simply one more obstacle standing in the way of a future construction project. Roslyn quietly placed the second letter beside the first. Money has a remarkable way of changing how people describe the same piece of land. Yesterday, it was worthless. Today, it is called an opportunity. That week, several friends stopped by after hearing about the offers. Most meant well. You've already done something wonderful, one woman told her. You've reunited families. Maybe that's enough. Another neighbor looked around the aging station with concern. Roslyn, this place is going to cost a fortune. Walter, the retired mechanic, stood silently for a moment before speaking. I hate to admit it. He glanced toward the sagging roof. But she's right. Roslyn understood their concern. She had begun receiving professional estimates for the repairs. None of them were encouraging. The roof above the main station required immediate stabilization before another harsh winter. The electrical system failed inspection. Several support beams inside the garage showed signs of structural weakness. Moisture had already begun creeping into parts of the building where historical documents were stored. One preservation specialist gently explained that unless climate conditions improved soon, some paper records could suffer permanent damage. Roslyn sat alone that evening, studying the estimates spread across Emmett's old desk. The numbers were overwhelming. For the first time since purchasing the station, she wondered whether determination alone could save it. Some dreams don't fail because people stop caring. They fail because caring isn't always enough to pay the bills. She looked across the shelves, holding the cassette tapes. 387 voices, hundreds of families, one unfinished promise. She quietly closed the contractor's folder. Giving up would certainly solve her financial problem, but it would create another one she wasn't sure she could live with. Meanwhile, nearly 200 miles away, Vernon noticed a newspaper resting on a table inside the country club where he met friends every Thursday afternoon. A photograph on the front page caught his attention. Roslyn stood smiling beside the restored entrance to the station while a family embraced outside room 7. The headline described how forgotten recordings were reconnecting families after decades of silence. Vernon frowned. One of the men at his table nodded toward the newspaper. Remarkable woman. Vernon forced a thin smile. She's always been sentimental. He shrugged dismissively. It'll fade once the excitement wears off. But even as he spoke the words, he found himself staring at the photograph a little longer than he intended. For years, he had believed Roslyn's greatest contribution had been helping build his company. Now, complete strangers admired her for something she had built entirely on her own. Success often reveals character, but sometimes it also exposes the people who failed to recognize it when it stood beside them every day. Back at the station, Roslyn decided she needed to understand why so many developers suddenly wanted the property. She visited the county planning office and requested public records related to the proposed highway improvements. Most of the documents discussed road widening, traffic studies, drainage projects, and land acquisition maps. Then one report caught her attention. The station's address appeared repeatedly throughout emergency transportation files dating back several decades. She pulled another report. The same address appeared again, then another. Curious, she requested additional archived records from the State Transportation Office. One by one, the documents painted an unexpected picture. During multiple severe winter storms throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, Emmett Calder's station had been officially designated as an emergency assistance location. Highway patrol officers directed stranded motorists there. Snowplow crews referenced it in operational reports. Emergency transportation coordinators listed it as a dependable refuge when roads became impassable. Roslyn leaned back in her chair. Not one person in town had mentioned this. Everyone remembered Emmett as an honest businessman. No one had spoken about the role he played during some of the region's worst winters. The station wasn't important only because of the cassette recordings. It had served an entirely different purpose, one preserved not in memories, but in government records. Roslyn carefully gathered copies of every report before leaving the archives. The developers could wait. The offers could wait. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just investigating Room 7 anymore. She was about to discover why the state remembered Emmett Calder, very differently than the town that had quietly forgotten him. Roslyn couldn't stop thinking about the transportation reports. They described Emmett Calder's station in a way no one in town ever had, not simply as a gas station, not simply as a roadside motel, but as an emergency assistance location. The words appeared again and again throughout the documents, each one raising the same quiet question. What had happened here that history remembered, but people had forgotten? The following week, Roslyn expanded her search far beyond the county courthouse. She spent mornings inside the Missouri State Archives reading old Department of Transportation records. Afternoons disappeared among newspaper microfilm, trucking association newsletters, and highway maintenance reports stored inside regional libraries. The deeper she searched, the clearer the picture became. During the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, long before drivers carried mobile phones or relied on satellite navigation, highways could become dangerous places with very little warning. Snowstorms trapped motorists for days. Mechanical failures left families stranded miles from the nearest town. Truck drivers often spent entire nights waiting for roads to reopen. Back then, a dependable roadside station could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Again and again, Roslyn found Emmett Calder's name. One state report described his station as a recommended emergency shelter during severe winter weather. Another instructed highway patrol officers to direct stranded motorists there whenever surrounding lodging reached capacity. A transportation bulletin praised local businesses that volunteered during blizzard response efforts. Emmett's station appeared at the top of the list. Roslyn quietly copied every document. Each page revealed another piece of a life that had never asked for recognition. She found newspaper articles describing record snowfalls that closed entire sections of highway. One article included a short paragraph that nearly escaped her notice. Local station owner Emmett Calder opened every available room to stranded travelers without charge until roads reopened. Another story reported that volunteer church groups delivered blankets to Calder's station because dozens of motorists had taken refuge there overnight. No interviews. No photographs celebrating Emmett, just simple reporting of quiet generosity. Some of the greatest acts of kindness never become headlines. They become habits, repeated so often that people eventually mistake them for ordinary. Roslyn also met people whose memories filled the spaces official records could not. A retired highway patrol officer leaned back in his chair after hearing Emmett's name. "We never worried if folks made it to Calder's place," he said. "We knew someone would answer the door." A former snowplow operator smiled, as though remembering an old friend. "We'd finish 16-hour shifts and stop there for coffee." He laughed softly. "Didn't matter whether you had money. If Emmett thought you needed a hot meal, you got one." At a regional trucking museum, Roslyn spoke with several retired long-haul drivers who had traveled that highway decades earlier. One man looked across the room before quietly saying, "Back then, we all knew one thing. If you could make it to Calder's station, you'd be all right." Another nodded. "We used to call him the man who never let anyone freeze." The words stayed with Roslyn long after the conversations ended. She suddenly understood something she had overlooked from the beginning. The cassette recordings were never the center of Emmett's story. They were only one expression of the kind of man he had always been. He offered shelter, food, safety, a listening ear, and eventually, a way for lonely people to leave something of themselves behind. Compassion had not started with the recordings. The recordings had simply grown out of compassion. That realization changed the entire investigation. Roslyn invited 2 local historians to examine Emmett's journals with her, hoping fresh eyes might notice details she had missed. For hours, they compared journal entries against maintenance records, inventory sheets, and transportation documents. Late that afternoon, one of the historians stopped turning pages. "Something isn't right." Roslyn looked up. "What do you mean?" He pointed toward several inventory references scattered throughout different journals. "The numbering keeps jumping." She studied the pages. He was right. One entry referenced Inventory 142. The next referred to Inventory 147. Later entries skipped entire groups of numbers again. The sequence wasn't random. Something had been removed from the filing system long before Room 7 was sealed. The discovery sent Roslyn back into the transportation archives. She requested additional inventory records connected to the station. Most contained nothing unusual. Then, buried inside an old departmental inventory list, one line caught her attention. "Calder Registry Book, Volume 2. She read it again. There was no mention anywhere of Volume 1, only Volume 2. Roslyn sat motionless. Documents like that weren't created by accident. If someone labeled a book Volume 2, another volume almost certainly existed first. She copied the page before carefully comparing it with Emmett's journals. Everything suddenly pointed in the same direction. The registry had not simply disappeared after Emmett's death. It hadn't necessarily been stolen. It had likely been separated from the office long before probate officials sealed Room 7. Perhaps it had been filed somewhere else inside the station. Perhaps hidden among ordinary business records no one had thought important enough to examine. The answer might have been sitting on those shelves all along, disguised as everyday paperwork. For weeks, Roslyn had searched for hidden compartments and missing boxes. Now she realized she had been asking the wrong question. She didn't need to search harder. She needed to think the way Emmett thought. As evening settled over the old highway, she returned to Room 7 carrying copies of every inventory record, journal reference, and transportation document she had collected. She looked slowly around the office. Every folder, every ledger, every cabinet, every shelf had been arranged by a man who believed one simple principle. If the truth matters, write it down. If Emmett had left the answer behind, he almost certainly hadn't hidden it. He had organized it. And Roslyn became convinced that somewhere inside the orderly system he had built, the missing registry was still waiting to be found. Roslyn unlocked Room 7 before sunrise. The office was as quiet as it had been the first day she stepped inside. Dust no longer distracted her, neither did the unanswered questions. For the first time since discovering the recordings, she wasn't searching for hidden spaces. She was searching for understanding. She sat behind Emmett's desk and looked slowly around the room. Every shelf, every cabinet, every ledger, every drawer. Weeks earlier, she had assumed the answer was missing. Now she wondered whether it had simply been overlooked. People often miss the truth because they search for something dramatic, when the real answer has been sitting patiently among ordinary things all along. Roslyn pulled one ledger from the shelf, then another. Soon the desk filled with payroll books, maintenance logs, fuel invoices, inventory records, and customer files. At first glance, they appeared unrelated. But she wasn't reading them for their individual stories. She was studying how Emmett thought. Page after page revealed the same habits. Every document carried a date. Every transaction included a reference number. Every ledger pointed toward another record somewhere else in the office. Nothing stood alone. Nothing relied on memory. Everything connected. Mr. Harper's words returned once more. If the truth matters, write it down. Emmett hadn't simply documented his business. He had built a system. Roslyn opened a notebook and began copying the reference numbers into columns. Maintenance reports connected to equipment inventories, payroll records matched employee schedules, fuel deliveries linked to supplier invoices. Every document quietly led to another. Hours passed unnoticed. Morning became afternoon. Sunlight shifted slowly across the office floor. Several times Roslyn believed she had reached another dead end. Each time she started again. Patience had brought her this far. It deserved one more chance. Then, a small detail caught her attention. One accounting ledger referenced a storage box identified only by an ordinary bookkeeping code. The description seemed almost painfully routine. Archived financial records, nothing more. No mention of recordings, no mention of journals, no mention of Emmett's personal files. Most people would have ignored it. Roslyn didn't. She walked toward the storage shelves lining the back wall. Every box remained arranged in numerical order. Eventually, she found the matching code. The cardboard container looked no different from dozens of others surrounding it. She carried it to the desk and carefully removed the lid. Inside rested exactly what the label promised: accounting journals, shipping invoices, fuel tax reports, bank reconciliation sheets. Nothing unusual. Roslyn almost smiled at herself. Perhaps this really was just another financial archive. Still, she continued, one folder at a time, one stack at a time. She lifted the final bundle of tax documents. Something heavier remained beneath them. Her heartbeat slowed. Resting at the bottom of the box, wrapped in faded brown paper, lay a large leather-bound ledger. She carefully brushed away the dust covering its worn cover. Only 3 handwritten words appeared. Registry, Volume 1. Roslyn closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not because she doubted what she was seeing, because every clue had finally led somewhere. She slowly opened the ledger. The first page contained a neatly handwritten index. Each entry listed a cassette number, driver's name, truck number, route, recording date, emergency contact, family address. Every recording inside room 7 appeared there. Every single one. As she turned the pages, the registry became even more remarkable. Beside many names, Emmett had added careful updates over the years. Driver, returned safely. Recording collected by wife. Address changed. Forwarded to daughter. Family notified. Some entries contained small cross-reference numbers directing readers to journal pages explaining later events. Others identified replacement addresses after families moved to different states. Nothing had been left to chance. Emmett had never intended those recordings to remain forgotten inside filing cabinets. He had created an entire system designed to reunite every voice with the people who loved it. The registry wasn't merely a list, it was the bridge connecting hundreds of ordinary lives. Roslyn continued reading. Each page strengthened what she already suspected. The cassette recordings had never been a collection. They had been a promise. One man quietly determined that no family should lose the sound of someone they loved simply because life ended too soon. Roslyn paused when she reached the final section of the ledger. Several pages remained unfinished. The handwriting looked slightly less steady than before. One dated entry explained that Emmett's health had been worsening. He admitted becoming tired more easily. Some mornings, even climbing the station steps left him short of breath. Yet his greatest concern wasn't himself, it was the recordings. He worried there wouldn't be enough time to finish updating every family's information. One sentence stopped Roslyn completely. "If I leave before this work is finished, I pray someone kinder than me finds a way to complete it." She turned one final page. Only a few lines had been written. The entry ended abruptly, as though interrupted before it could be finished. The final sentence read, "If these voices survive longer than I do, don't remember me. Remember the people who trusted me with their stories." Roslyn gently rested her hand across the page. The room fell completely silent. For several moments, she couldn't bring herself to move. She finally understood why Emmett never placed himself at the center of any recording. He never wanted history to celebrate him. He wanted history to remember ordinary people whose lives would otherwise disappear without leaving a trace. There is a quiet kind of greatness the world rarely notices. It doesn't ask for applause, it simply leaves behind something better than it found. Roslyn carefully closed the ledger. The investigation that had begun with a mysterious door had become something far larger. She now possessed Emmett's journals, the master registry, the transportation records, probate documents, photographs, business files, and testimony from families whose lives had already been changed by hearing familiar voices again. Together, they told one complete story, not just about a gas station, but about a man who quietly served an entire region without asking for recognition. Roslyn placed the registry beside the other evidence she had gathered over the past several weeks. Outside, another car slowed near the station. Perhaps another family. Perhaps another developer. It no longer mattered. She finally understood what her next step had to be. Before commercial interests could reduce the property to another piece of valuable land, she would place the entire historical record before county officials, preservation experts, Emmett's surviving heirs, and the community that had unknowingly driven past one of its greatest treasures for decades. The meeting was held inside the County Historical Society's largest hall. County officials sat beside preservation specialists. Transportation historians flipped through carefully organized folders. Emmett Calder's surviving relatives quietly greeted retired truck drivers who had traveled those old highways decades earlier. Local residents filled the remaining seats, while several developers watched silently from the back of the room. Everyone had come to answer one question: what should become of the abandoned station? Roslyn didn't begin with opinions, she began with evidence. She carefully presented the probate records, explaining why Room 7 had remained legally sealed for more than 40 years. Next came the transportation archives, documenting the station's official role as an emergency refuge during severe winter storms. Then she introduced Emmett's journals, allowing his own handwritten words to explain the compassion that had quietly shaped his life. Finally, she placed the recovered registry beside the cassette recordings. The room became completely still. One document supported another. Every journal matched the registry. Every registry entry matched a recording. Every recording matched a real family. And every family confirmed the truth. Retired truck drivers stood one after another to describe nights when Emmett opened every room without charging a single dollar. Former highway patrol officers explained how stranded motorists were routinely directed to Calder's station because someone there always answered the door. Snowplow operators remembered arriving exhausted after 16-hour shifts, only to find hot coffee waiting. Families spoke softly about hearing the voices of parents they believed had been lost forever. No one exaggerated. No one needed to. The evidence spoke with remarkable clarity. By the end of the hearing, the abandoned station no longer appeared to be forgotten commercial property. It had become something far greater, an irreplaceable piece of regional transportation history. One of the few surviving oral archives preserving the everyday lives of American truck drivers who helped keep the country moving long before modern technology transformed the highways. The Preservation Board called for a vote. Every hand rose. Not one voice opposed the motion. The decision was unanimous. Room 7, the station, and everything Emmett Calder had spent his life protecting would receive permanent historical preservation. Roslyn quietly closed her eyes. She wasn't celebrating a victory. She was witnessing the completion of a promise that had waited more than 40 years for someone willing to finish it. Working alongside Emmett's heirs, transportation historians, local volunteers, and preservation specialists, Roslyn helped establish a nonprofit foundation dedicated to preserving the station, protecting the recordings, and continuing to collect the stories of retired truck drivers across America. Historical grants funded structural restoration. Museum partnerships helped preserve fragile journals and documents. Community donations repaired the buildings without erasing their history. The cracked pavement remained. The rusted fuel pumps were carefully preserved beneath the weathered canopy. Not because they could still pump gasoline, but because they reminded every visitor where the story had begun. The 7 roadside rooms found new purpose. 6 became small exhibits, telling the story of life along America's forgotten highways. The 7th remained exactly as Roslyn had first discovered it. The calendar still displayed October 1983. The adding machine still rested on the desk. The coffee cup remained beside it. The maps still covered the wall. Nothing inside room 7 was rearranged. Visitors didn't come to see an old office. They came to step inside a single, unfinished afternoon that had finally been allowed to continue. Months passed. The old station slowly became one of Missouri's most meaningful roadside landmarks, not because it was famous, but because it felt personal. Families arrived carrying faded photographs. Children sat beside grandparents wearing headphones, listening to voices that had traveled across 4 decades before finally finding their way home. Retired truck drivers walked quietly through the exhibits, recognizing names they hadn't spoken in years. Some visitors laughed, many cried. Nearly everyone left carrying something they hadn't brought with them. One Saturday afternoon, a little girl walked out of room 7, holding her grandfather's photograph. She looked up at Roslyn. "Were you friends with him?" Roslyn smiled warmly. "No." The little girl frowned. "Then how did you know where to find him?" Roslyn knelt beside her. "I didn't. I just made sure you could." The little girl hugged the photograph tightly before running back to her family. Roslyn watched her disappear into the crowd. In that quiet moment, she finally understood why she had been led to this forgotten place. She hadn't rescued a building. She had reunited families with pieces of themselves they believed were gone forever. Sometimes the greatest thing we leave behind isn't money, or success, or even our own name. Sometimes it's making sure someone else's story is never forgotten. One cool autumn afternoon, another visitor arrived without announcing himself. Vernon. He walked slowly across the restored property, saying very little. Children laughed beneath the old canopy. Former truck drivers shared coffee where they had once rested between deliveries. Inside room 7, a father wished his little girl a happy birthday more than 40 years after recording the message. Vernon stood quietly watching. For years, he believed success could be measured by revenue, contracts, and buildings. Now he saw strangers thanking Roslyn. He saw families embracing after hearing voices they thought were gone forever. He finally understood something he had failed to see during 52 years of marriage. He had built a successful business. Roslyn had built something people carried in their hearts. He approached her quietly. "I'm sorry." There were no excuses, no explanations, only honesty. Roslyn looked at him with the same kindness she had shown every family who walked through those doors. "Thank you for saying it." She had already forgiven him, not because the past no longer hurt, but because she no longer wanted the past deciding the future. Some apologies repair relationships, others simply set people free. When Vernon walked away, Roslyn felt no anger, no triumph, no need to prove anything. The woman who had once driven away from her home, believing her life was over, no longer needed anyone's approval to know her worth. As evening settled over the old highway, Roslyn stepped quietly into room 7. The office looked exactly as it had the day she first unlocked the door. The calendar still rested on October 1983. The coffee cup still waited beside the adding machine. The truck route maps still covered the wall. Only one thing had changed: the silence. It no longer belonged there. From the listening room nearby came the voices of fathers, mothers, veterans, newlyweds, and lonely travelers who had once believed their words would disappear with the miles. Instead, they had found their way home. Roslyn stood quietly in the doorway and smiled. At 75, she thought she had lost everything that mattered. She never imagined the most important work of her life would begin after the world had decided her story was over. Some people inherit fortunes, others inherit responsibilities. Roslyn inherited a promise, and because she chose to keep it, a forgotten highway found its voice again. Hundreds of families found pieces of the people they loved, and an elderly woman who had once been left behind discovered that the richest legacy is never measured by what we own, but by what we refuse to let the world forget.